Howdy, I'm Max Keiser. I think it was Karl Marx who said something like capitalism would eventually sell the rope to hang itself. There is some poetic, karmic wheel of justice at work here. Let's check in with Stacy.
Right, Max. Well, Keiser Report has warned you basically for the last few years that the fourth turning will meet the Thucydides trap. We will see deglobalization and de-dollarization. That has been happening nonstop over the past 4 or 5 years, as we've been reporting on it. The birds are chirping about this. They love this. So, we have the fourth turning, and that's this generational shift that is happening in America. The rise of these the young millennial and Generation Z, and the decline of the baby boomer generation disappearing. But we have deglobalization and de-dollarization happening. So those all collide in this headline. And I'm going to start with the fourth turning. So this is what you're seeing with this. And the unrest is largely to do with also the Thucydides trap, the fact that China is now the rising power, that the power available to the American elite is disintegrating. Fundstrat's Lee says new stock market investment theme is, quote, violence in America. So this was reported on Dow Jones Market Watch. And this is what they say. The past 12 months in the U.S. has been particularly tumultuous, framed by the COVID-19 pandemic and marked by a number of episodes of civil unrest on the grounds of inequality and politics. And that turmoil is something investors should bank on for the longer term, according to at least one strategist. Thomas Lee, founder of Fundstrat Global Advisors, says that violent crimes in the U.S. have been on the rise and does not envision that abating soon, as the U.S. is locked in the throes of the worst pandemic in generations and a change of leadership in the Oval Office that has been less than smooth. So he talks about all the protests across America this summer. We saw just cities being burned down, and now we see the Capitol Hill riots. So this, he said, is going to continue.
Right. How do you make money off it? That's the question.
That's what he's asking.
This is a theme that has always fascinated me, how markets can attract investors who are investing in destruction of their own country or their own communities. It's like similar to the business model of the mafia, when they burn down a restaurant, right? And they collect on the insurance, et cetera. But I thought of just a few examples of this that we've covered over the years.
Okay.
That is similar leading up to this. For example, the private prison industry. Yeah. This is an industry that attracts capital, and then they make deals with the municipalities to keep 98% occupancy, and they go around and they arrest a lot of black people without any reason except to fill the prison. How about negative interest rates? That in itself is an investment you're investing in the destruction of your bond market, of your capital markets, and yet it's attracted trillions and trillions of dollars. How about the OxyContin manufacturers? We've talked about them. They've killed 70,000 Americans last year. So people invest in those companies, and they're investing in the destruction. And then going back a few years, of course, we talked about Monsanto and their Terminator seeds. That was destroying the entire global agricultural market, but you were doing so to make some quick profits. So this theme of investing in chaos and kind of meltdown of the country has been with us for a while. This could be the final comeuppance. It's
also pointing out that you can't fight the trend. If the trend is this, and the trend is for more violence, and the trend is towards like late 1800s, early 1900s America, anarchists blowing up buildings and chaos, it's just a fact. You can say, okay, I just got to go with it. Leave all your cash in the U.S. In U.S. dollars in the bank and hope it doesn't disappear. Or you can say, well, how do I protect my wealth? How do I make sure that me and my family survive this and come out the other side? So these are just the facts. This is what happens. The OxyContin thing you're talking about, those are deaths of despair. The deaths of the despair were inevitable due to the institutions failing. And that's important in the next statement he makes. The events of the past week in Washington, in my view, are symptomatic of a greater challenge facing America, that Americans are taking action into their own hands outside of legal avenues, possibly because of the loss of faith in institutions, Lee wrote, referring to the riot by supporters of President Trump at the Capitol, which resulted in at least 5 deaths. So this is something, again, that Keiser Report has been warning you about. And if we say there's a loss of faith in the institutions, well, you could either just say, okay, so what? Or you have to do something to protect yourself. We've been saying about Bitcoin, Bitcoin is a sign of the loss of faith in the institutions of the fiat world. And this is just the inevitability. This was written in the cards once these cycles were set in motion. Once we set in 2000 under Joe Biden was a big champion of it. Once we sent all our manufacturing jobs to China, it was written in stone what would happen in the future. Okay, maybe it's the water of politics could have altered the outcome of what was written in that stone. They could have done something to avoid, say, all the overdose deaths. They could have done something differently once we got rid of all our manufacturing. But the fact is, like, these are just the cycles and how to prepare yourself.
Right, and here's why the problem is intractable, and that it used to be that institutions dominated public life and dominated civil society, and then starting around the 80s into deregulation and the Reagan-Thatcher era, financialization took over, and so institutions became the servant of the markets, and everything had a price, and everything was traded on the stock exchange, and everything became financialized, and our institutions shrunk in value and dominance down to almost nothing. And so at the moment, what we're hearing is that the investor class has no responsibility in kind of a wacko Milton Friedman-esque way to anything but their own self-aggrandizement. And they have no responsibility to society whatsoever. It's a complete breakdown of the social contract, and we're now into a chaotic period. Paul Tudor Jones looked at this and he said, you know what? Bitcoin is actually a bet on humanity. And whereas buying into these plays that add flame to the societal breakdown, as Wall Street's recommending now, of course, why wouldn't they? Then you need to decide on your own volition, do I want to be a part of the problem and invest in the destruction of America? Or do I want to buy Bitcoin and invest in humanity and hope that the idea of America survives this meltdown?
Yeah, and I think it's important that it's more globalized. Like, people in our Telegram group, they come from all corners of the earth. I feel like a Bitcoiner. I don't feel like American. It's like, if this system has to collapse, and then it has to collapse, because that's the motions, the outcome, the fate is written in stone. As I said, its outcome was determined once you decided certain things. Once you introduce a Commodity Futures Modernization Act and legalized basically theft, right? Predatory gambling using the assets of the nation. Once you introduce China into the WTO on the favored nation status that it was introduced on, and once you got rid of Glass-Steagall, like, certain things were just inevitable. They were going to happen. This was going to happen. Once we had cable news, and these cable news coalesced around targeted ads that, as a former banker, hate sells. Hate is a great way to sell. It's way better than convincing somebody to love themselves and care about the future. Like, to tell somebody, like, battle ready, Antifa protesters dressed head to toe in black and armed with shields march on Manhattan to demand Trump and Pence leave White House now. So it looks like an organized military. They're in full military. It looks like North Korea military, or any military around the world. People are stoking this. There's financial incentives, and it's stoking both sides of this. And it's inevitable with the failure, as Thomas Lee, a Fundstrat, said, that the loss of faith in institutions. And we're getting a history lesson. Like, this explains what happened during the dark ages of Europe. This explains how people coalesced around one lord to go fight some other lord. Like, how did it happen? Like, why do you go traveling across the world to go die somewhere? Like, what's the point? But this is the same thing that happens over and over throughout human society.
Yeah, I see this as the bookend to shock and awe, if you remember shock and awe, the Iraq invasion part 1 under Norman Schwarzkopf, and the way the cable news cheered it on, and then the U.S. killed 500,000 Iraqis.
That was under Bush 1.
Bush 1 for fun. They did it for fun. And the Thucydides trap refers specifically to the U.S. and, of course, the U.S. giving way to China. And it's still the world reserve currency. So the U.S., incredibly, even in this late stage of the game, still has some importance in the world, although it's rapidly falling. And we'll see. This fourth turning meets Thucydides trap meets Bitcoin is going to create quite a fascinating 2021.
It's actually better, having lived in Europe for a long time, they used to be powerful empires. They used to have powerful imperial powers and armies around the world. They live way better, the individual citizens, than an American citizen, by my own observation. So, power, people are trained to like want power for their lords, like Lord Maddow must have power. And I love that, like, even though you were sitting in some sort of squat with barely any food and no heating on, like, you feel like if that's your only source of empowerment, it actually can get better in some ways. But I want to also mention in the last few minutes here that we have this deglobalization thing happening in response to this, because the world, like, if you're inside this fishbowl of the hate, these two sides of hate, coalescing into, like, the spiral of hate that is getting worse and worse, from outside, this is what it looks like when the coordination of Silicon Valley, and obviously Silicon Valley, they're all the CEOs are Democrats and they're choosing sides. So we saw them deplatform President Trump like over a week ago. And here's two Twitter responses, one from Branko Milanovic, who is he's an academic and writes about wealth inequality. He's done that for decades and he's really good at that. And then Bruno Maches, who's a former Portuguese politician. So Bruno says, time to start a debate in Europe on whether we want to stay tightly connected to a US internet, where repression of speech will keep growing. Because as these battle lines get harder and harder and more, like, we got rid of the hardliners, now we need to go to those who are kind of sympathetic to the Republicans or sympathetic to Trump, or the 75 million who voted for Trump. So do you want to be on that internet connected to that sort of system where, Amazon, Google, all of them work in coordination to target people? And then Branko Milanovic, in response to Trump being deplatformed, said, it is beyond bizarre. Does Twitter have the right to decide? Should Twitter ban Hong Kong protesters or Belarus demonstrations or Gilets jaunes? The final result will be the balkanization of platforms. So I think that's one trend. If you want to look at a trend to invest in or short or look for other alternatives to the internet as we know it, like, that could be something you see the growth of as we have a balkanization of it.
Right. Europe looks at this aghast, and which is ironic, because a lot of the people that are defending it are citing European history as the reason for it. But then the Germans in particular don't agree with Arnold. All right, we're going to take a break. And when we come back, much more coming your way. Welcome back to the Keiser Report. I'm Max Keiser. Time now to turn to Dave Collum. He is a chemistry professor who, for the past decade, has been writing a legendary year in review at the end of each increasingly mad economic year. Dave, great to see you again.
Hey, it's a thrill to be with you guys.
All right, well, let's get into this report. So your 2020 year in review is called The Year Everything Changed. Your review covers many topics, but which are the 2 or 3 biggest economic changes you saw in 2020? Let's focus on what is the biggest change you saw in 2020, Dave.
We did a controlled demolition of the economy, which I don't think is going to make its way back in any sort of easily foreseeable future. So I think we've undermined the wealth-creating capabilities of the economy.
That's interesting, because the economy looks like it has kind of crashed, right? The small to medium-sized enterprises are getting wiped out. And there doesn't seem to be a lot of talk about how that is the seed stock that fuels the economy going forward. It seems like people can liberally just kind of ignore them and let the majors like the Amazons of the world take everything. So you're calling this a controlled demolition. So is it a controlled demolition, or was it just kind of an unforeseen consequence of really bad policies?
Well, the question is, what was the motivation of the really bad policy? And at this point, I can at least entertain the possibility that they knew what they were doing, because I can't believe they're all that stupid. And so I think it was sort of a controlled demolition. I saw a stat just the other day, said that 275,000 restaurants died in December, right? Those are 275,000 restaurants worth of employees who are who don't have alternatives, right? Restaurants, waiters, various things like that they don't have other jobs. That's where the bottom rung you go to sort of get started and to put food on the table and stuff like that. They're gone.
Right. And many of those, of course, are family businesses. So when you take out the restaurant, you're really impacting the entire family. So that's an enormous damage sociologically and economically. Now, this kind of leads me to my next question here. Senator McConnell, his front door was recently vandalized with spray paint asking, "Where's my money?" So is this part and parcel of the same thing? If it's a controlled demolition, and we are going into an era of money printing, and some call it monetary theory, et cetera. Are these two connected? Is this like a segue into this new reality where everyone is completely dependent on the state for their money and they have no jobs? Dave.
Well, it's a little surreal that modern monetary theory, which has been banging around for 100 years, which basically says, look, you can either tax people or just print money, and the tax shows up in other ways. It blew into view in 2019, and now all of a sudden it's being used in 2020. I find that a little odd. The government mandated shutdowns sort of make it a must. So I'm not a big fan of government writing checks instead of people doing jobs. But when you forcibly shut them down, you got to do something. So they kind of made modern monetary theory a necessary evil, which therefore gets back to what were the shutdowns about.
Now, you use a phrase also here, which is interesting. You talk about an investable world. So let's talk about a section of your year in review called Wealth Creation. And you ask, is it even possible anymore? And I guess that segues into, do we have an investable world anymore? I guess this is what hinting at is that it's like the death of capitalism is what it sounds like, Dave. Am I wrong?
I mean, a good comparison, which I do, 24 pages of, you look at what are the silicon-based juggernauts of the present. I don't think they create a lot of wealth. So you can say that Google is this phenomenal company. They scrape data, whether you like that or not, I don't care. But it's really, that makes it basically a fancy advertising company. Do you really want to compare Twitter to U.S. Steel? Do you really want to compare, here's a good one, Salesforce versus Pfizer, Salesforce versus Raytheon, which I'm not a big fan of what Raytheon makes, but at least they make stuff. And so we're heading towards this world where the companies don't actually, in my opinion, create wealth. Facebook could disappear tomorrow and we would notice nothing, precisely nothing. And so is this wealth creation? The answer is no. It's wealth aggregation because people are getting fabulously wealthy owning shares, but that makes it kind of a Ponzi scheme. Tesla went up the other day, 60 billion. A little quick math told me Tesla jumped in one day, the equivalent of $200,000 per car made in the last calendar year. What kind of crazy market is that? There's nothing saying. So that makes it non-investable to me.
And Elon Musk of Tesla said recently, if you want stuff, you got to make stuff. So he's referring to the fact that he's making cars and I guess kind of differentiate himself from some of these other Silicon Valley companies that are just making software and are scaling by adding in more servers. And the cost of doing that, the bottom line, is enhanced pretty dramatically. And the question I have for you, Professor, is I've often thought about this question. The public domain, which is the common domain, the open free space, seems to have been completely impinged by big tech, and that we no longer have a public domain. We no longer have free space. People don't go to the library anymore. They don't go to the necessarily, what I'm saying here. Is that the common domain? Is the common domain been obliterated?
I've been fighting on Twitter a lot since the election and since the Capitol chaos. And the $1 million question is, can Twitter boot someone because they are they're not a private concern, they're publicly owned, but they're not a government concern. And you fire back with can you exclude blacks from your diner? No, right? Race, creed, color is politics, not creed. And so very reasonable people under normal circumstances are making the argument that Twitter can blow out 70,000 people because they're politically on the wrong side. I can actually understand them blowing out Trump I can kind of get my brain around it, but they blew out General Flynn and they blew out a lot. Ron Paul got knocked off Facebook. Ron Paul's never said anything inflammatory in his life. He's a sweetheart of a guy, and he's never angry. He never shows the anger. They blew him right out. This to me is a combination of a First Amendment breach in a serious way. And I really, for the first time in my life, have talked about the rise of authoritarianism in the United States.
You know, people are quick to malign the government, but the government would give us things like the telecommunications network that were developed and maintained by the government, upon which these applications rests. So therefore, they're on the public domain, and they are adherent to the Constitution. The argument of private enterprise is simply, I can't open a hot dog store, a shop in the middle of a highway. The government built the highway. I cannot build a hot dog stand in the middle of the highway, right? Similarly, I cannot build a public enterprise and interfere with the public's business. So does this mean, and a lot of people are talking about this, that the U.S. government has, the technocrats and the government have fused together in what's called a corpocracy? Have we reached that tipping point now where there is no real public government, citizen government buy-in for the people?
I think so. And where it's gotten weird, you know, there's no doubt in the old days when John D. Rockefeller was romping around that he had, you know, connections to government. And the guys who built the nation in the Industrial Revolution certainly had political ties. Again, it's abrogation of free speech, which is now at great risk. And if you pay attention to what's going on in the current dialogue, there's this sense of expunging people who have the wrong political views. I just saw an article today. The college admissions group that handle all college admissions just sent out an email talking about what happened at the Capitol. And there was no room for discussion. It was all stated as complete fact. And I'm asking, why are we sending to every college-bound kid in the country this what is somewhere between a contestable argument and propaganda? So our media's let us down. I'm horrified at how bad our media is at this point. We depend on you, folks like you and Stacy. We depend on the bloggers. We depend on scavenging it ourselves. The media itself is so horrible that I would say get rid of it, except for the fact that that's going the wrong direction, right? So I don't know what to do. I'm at a loss.
It's a great point to dig deeper into, but I kind of want to switch gears here for a second, because you're calling a top in the bond market. This has been a widowmaker for years and years and years. Everyone who's called a top in the bond market has gone on to see the bonds trade a lot higher. Why? Right. What has brought you to this conclusion, Dave? Are you the next generation of those who are going to lose money on this bet, or what's going on? Dave, tell us, why is the bond market overextended?
No, I'm not going to lose money because I'm not betting against it. I am staying up way out of the splash zone. And so I've learned not to short anything. So Tesla looks like a Ponzi scheme to me. I don't short Tesla. No one in the right mind would do that at this point. The bond market may not be near a top. We could go to negative 10% interest rates. So of course the bond market go anywhere it wants. Where the bond market currently exists is that you can't own bonds and make any money. There's no way to profit from bonds unless you're a dexterous trader. And we're not traders. Most of us are not traders. So six-pack boomers, retirement funds, none of those are qualified traders. David Tepper is a trader. So the bond market is no longer worth anything as a revenue stream.
So it is patently a Ponzi scheme. Absolutely. Anyone making money on it, it comes from the new money being injected into it from the central bank to the point where they're actually negative yielding bonds at this point. And this is one of the biggest Ponzi schemes ever in the history. I know interest rates in America are trading at a 240-year low. Interest rates in the United Kingdom are trading at a 300-year low. That's how much of a bubble we're talking here. Now, you recently said on Chris Martinson's podcast that the problem for governments is that they can't tax deflation. They can tax inflation. Elaborate.
This is a concept I came up with last year when I was talking about the evils, the perceived evils of deflation. The reason deflation is hated is multifold. One is in a currently inherently inflationary banking system, right? That if you pay interest on debt, you're going to be increasing the money supply naturally. If you have a deflationary event, it means something screwed up royally, and that something is undoubtedly tied to central banks. So when we get a big deflation, central banks blew something badly. So they don't like that. The second thing is that if we, for example, get no appreciation of our assets, but things get 5% cheaper each year, for us, that's a 5% real yield. But for governments that tax you, there's no taxable event. And in fact, if there's a real deflation and your assets go down, you get to log in some tax exemptions for future years. So governments need inflation to tax the nominal returns.
Professor, we're going to have to carry you over to a second segment. I'm learning a lot in your classroom. I hope that's okay. But for this segment, thanks for being on Keiser Report.
I'm glad to be here. Love to do a second session. Let's do it.
All right, and that's going to do it for this edition of Keiser Report with me, Max Keiser, and Stacy Herbert. I want to thank our guest, Dave Collum. Until next time, bye, y'all.